Hello, this is Catherine from Accelerated Reader Reading Books for You. Today I will be reading Chapter 10 from The Moon and the Magic Box by Michael Ross, illustrated by Magdalena Adic. Before I begin reading, I would like to give a big thanks to the author for sending me this book to read on my channel. In the description below, I've included links where you may find and purchase this book. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Chapter 10, A Daring Rescue. The zip ties around the wrists of Troy and Desme were beginning to chafe their wrists. It didn't help that the driver of the SUV was driving at breakneck speed. The SUV was bouncing around all over the place. Nesbit was leaning on Troy and was upset. He would lick Troy's hands, then turn his head to growl menacingly at the two MPs sitting opposite them. Within a few minutes, they had arrived at the security gates. They only seemed to slow down a fraction while they were waved through. Then they were off again. There were several prefabricated green housing units, a mess hall, latrines, and a secure detection center that would also double up as the interrogation unit. The SUV now slowed right down to 10 MP, and Troy and Desme noticed the tall towers at the entrance, at the top of which there were a couple of soldiers fully armed. Strangely, amid the low green buildings, there was one white building, with a large painted sign outside it which read RTB Programming Center. The SUVs came to a stop outside the interrogation unit. Desme and Troy were shoved out and made to stand still by the side of the SUV. They were joined by Blackmood and Cringeworthy, who happened to be looking very pleased with himself. Darling had already put a makeshift rope lead around Nesbit's neck. Darling looked frightened to death. He was not happy that he had been put in charge of this flea-bitten mutt. He was undoubtedly no dog lover. To Darling, a dog had two ends, one which was full of very sharp teeth and threatened to eat you, and the other from which something unthinkable and smelly would extrude every so often. Darling and Nesbit were circling each other, both being very wary. At one point, without Darling realizing what Nesbit was doing, Nesbit had crouched his back and down to perform. When he had finished, they started circling one another again. At this point, Cringeworthy, who was just to one side of Darling and Nesbit, had barked out orders to the MPs to frog march Troy and Desme into separate cells in the detention block. Blackmood had never seen her boss looking so self-satisfied and smug. Cringeworthy stepped back a pace to survey his success on his capture of Troy and Desme, and without realizing, he stepped into the mess that Nesbit had deposited on the floor a few moments previously. Cringeworthy's nose started to twitch, and he sniffed the air. He thought, "What is that disgusting smell?" He looked around, trying to pinpoint where it was coming from. It was certainly strong and very unpleasant, at which point he looked down and noticed the brown squashed mess on the ground next to his right foot. He lifted his foot and saw the brown stain on the sole of his shoe and immediately realized what had happened. Cringeworthy was shaking with anger and shouted at Darling, "Darling, do you know what I have stepped in? Do you? It is the mess that has been left on the floor by that smelly mutt you are supposed to be in charge of. For God's sake, man, you couldn't have a simpler job. And you can't even get that right. I'm going to have to go and change my shoes. Blackmood, get this mutt tied up somewhere out of harm's way. Then meet me in the interrogation block." Cringeworthy limped off to change his shoes. While Troy was led to the interrogation block, he noticed metal box-like machines with hidden wheels trundling around. All around the camp were yellow lines, and it appeared that these machines were following the yellow lines. These boxes had lights on top that flashed when they were moving. They also made a beep-beep noise when moving. They had doors on each side and a tray built onto the top. There was also a small CCTV camera and speaker on the front leading edge at the top. On the front-facing panel was a blue digital display. These were in fact robotic, and they came with the contingent of scientists that were on the base. These moving boxes were primarily used for moving papers and equipment to the various buildings on site. They had a sensor underneath the machines that would enable the boxes to follow the yellow lines. Where they were destined to go would be programmed into each machine's computer interface when they were ready to be utilized. Troy had his zip ties removed and was shoved into one room. It was quite small and appeared to be a holding cell. There was a small window on the outside wall with bars. There was one fluorescent strip on the ceiling. In one corner, there was a makeshift camp bed, which was very basic, with a regulation army pillow, one cotton sheet, and a simple gray blanket. And in the other corner, a crude metal toilet with no toilet seat. It was the same for Desmi as well, and she was put in a cell at the opposite end of the row of holding cells, so she couldn't communicate with Troy, or so the army authorities thought. Darling thought it best to leave the dog in the same cell as Desmi, but had anyone searched and checked to see if they were carrying mobiles? Nope. Troy, with his back to the door to his cell, was quickly texting Desmi, wondering how their friends had got on. And his mom was now up to speed, and Pengy knew what was happening. Troy then texted his mom and Bragger in quick succession, and soon learned they were on their way with Pengy to attempt a rescue operation. They would have to case the camp and decide the best way to formulate the rescue. No sooner had he read the last text message when the door was unbolted and in stormed two MPs and Dum. Dum did indeed have a dark side to his nature. He was inherently cruel. He was the one during operations over in Afghanistan that needed to be warned. On more than one occasion, that his interrogation techniques were a little too harsh. Cruelty comes in many forms. With Dum, it was a lack of compassion, a failure to connect with the human side of a prisoner he was interrogating. Troy could tell there was something in Dum's eyes that made Troy feel very wary, and he didn't like it. But Troy was a loyal character, especially for those he loved and cared for, and that was important to him. And Peggy and the magic box were very important to him. Troy was manhandled to the interrogation room, already waiting where Cringeworthy, who was nonchalantly sitting in a chair behind a large desk in the corner of the room. Blackmood was there as well. She was sat behind a small desk and in charge of a video camera. The MPs sat Troy roughly down on a metal chair in the middle of the room. His wrists were bound behind him again. Troy looked around the room. It had a fluorescent strip in the ceiling, but it was off. Instead, there were two large spotlights in each of the opposite corners of the room facing him. And although they were not switched on, they were aimed at Troy and the chair he was sitting in. There was another much smaller table to one side of the chair Troy was in. Dum walked over to it and unraveled what looked like a brown cloth. When he unraveled it, he could see it contained hypodermic syringes filled with truth serum. To the side of those were unusual-looking metal instruments, similar to objects you may see in a dentist's surgery. It had already been arranged that all these objects were there to frighten Troy. They would never actually be used on him. But at this stage, Troy didn't know that. Troy glanced at Cringeworthy, up at Dum, and finally at Blackmood. Now, what could he see in Blackmood's eyes? Now, he could sense she had a lot of compassion. He would go as far as to say that she was not happy at all in the way this interrogation was proceeding. Blackmood got up and went to Troy and whispered, "The shackles are not too tight on your wrists, are they, Troy?" She said it with a gentleness that immediately made Troy feel a little less anxious. Cringeworthy, though, barked out, "Sit down, Blackmood. Let Dum get on with his job." Blackmood turned around and made her way back to her desk. As she sat down, she noticed Cringeworthy giving her the nod to start recording the interrogation, which she did. Dum switched on the spotlights that made Troy blink and look down towards the floor. Dum sauntered over to Troy, and, while looking at him directly in the eyes, rattled the metal objects of torture on the little table just to one side. "Do you know what these are used for, boy?" spat Dum. "We use these to, how shall I say? Ah, yes, to persuade a person, be they man, woman, or even child, to tell the truth. That is all we want here. It's very simple. Tell me where the box is, and if there is an alien of any sort associated with it. And we will let you, your girlfriend, and your flea-bitten dog go. Simple as that. Well, Desme is not my girlfriend. She is a very close friend. Why don't you just get your facts right before you go and shoot your mouth off? No sooner had Troy said that when Dum suddenly appeared in front of him with a face like thunder. He swiftly brought his arm back and unleashed the back of his hand with all the force he could muster and hit Troy right across his face. So hard, in fact, that Troy was thrown to the floor. For a second or two, Troy had double vision, and a little trickle of blood ran down his chin from the corner of his mouth. Troy heard Blackmood gasp and saw her put her hand to her mouth. She looked at Cringeworthy, silently imploring him to intervene. This was too much for someone so young. It should not be happening. But Cringeworthy just stared ahead and was unmoved. But a moment later, Cringeworthy stood up, pulled Dum to one side, and whispered to him, "A little less violence, Dum. Let's go with the questioning first. Try to control yourself. He is winding you up, and he has the upper hand at the moment. You may revisit the physical side a little later." Cringeworthy went and sat down and shouted out, "Proceed, Dum." Dum indicated to the MPs to lift Troy back onto the chair. By now, Troy was livid, and he angrily said to Dum, "If you even as much touch a hair on Desmy's head, I will make you regret it. I promise you." Dum just laughed out loud, but just as quickly he stopped. He bent down until his nose was inches away from Troy's nose and whispered, "Little boy, you are in no position to make idle threats like that. Now, why don't you tell me something I want to hear?" Dum moved back and stood up, waiting for Troy to respond. Troy started nodding. He looked at Cringeworthy and then stared directly into Dum's eyes and said slowly and carefully, "All right, then, you win. I have got something you want to hear about more than anything." At this point, Troy started to whisper, so low, in fact, that Dum had to lean very close to Troy to hear what he was saying. Dum put his ear close to Troy's mouth. "Your breath stinks even more than Major Crappy Pants over there." Dum was incensed. He stood up and raised his arm to strike Troy again. But this time you could see there would be a lot more anger involved. At the last minute, Cringeworthy stood up and shouted out, "Stop!" Blackmood caught Troy's eyes. They were full of apology. She did not like what was happening here at all. Cringeworthy turned to the MPs and ordered them to take Troy back to his cell. He then turned to Dum and remarked, "We will continue questioning him later. Bring that girl in now. We may have better luck with her." Troy was dragged out. Already the side of his mouth had swollen up, and he was angry, very angry. And as he was being led away, Troy shouted out, "Better not touch Desmy. I swear you will regret it." As it happens, Cringeworthy changed his mind. He decided that they would have a long overdue lunch break. He turned to Blackmood and told her that interrogation would continue in an hour and a half's time. Cringeworthy and Dumb leapt. Blackmood sat down. That was it. It was the final straw. A whole gambit of emotions welled up in her. She was being treated like a second-hand citizen, being referred to as a man, the constant rudeness from Cringeworthy, and now this inhumane treatment of this poor boy. It was terrible to witness. As she thought about this, her eyes began to well up with tears. Deep down in her heart, she knew she had to do something to help Troy, Desme, and Nesbit. She loved dogs, and whenever in the few times she was close to Nesbit, he would wag his tail and muzzle her head. She made sure Cringeworthy couldn't see this. It wouldn't bode well for her. She needed to do something, and if it meant a court-martial, so be it. She grabbed a small bowl of warm water, some cotton wool, and made her way to Troy's cell. Outside were the two burly MPs. They stood in front of her and said, "You can't go in there, Sergeant. Strict orders from Major Cringeworthy that none other than Sergeant Dumb or Darling are allowed entry." But Blackmood was adamant she was going in. So she lied through her teeth for the first time. To her, it was a white lie. So she said, "I am the personal aide to Major Cringeworthy, and he insisted I made sure that the prisoner has recovered. Do you understand the trouble you would be in if the boy collapsed because you did not allow me to check that he is okay?" For a moment, both MPs hesitated, but rather than have the full wrath of Major Cringeworthy crashing down on their heads, they unlocked the door and stood back. They told Blackmood that they were under strict orders to keep the door locked at all times. So, when she was ready to exit, would she please knock on the door and they would unlock the door. Blackmood sauntered into Troy's cell. Troy was sat on the edge of the bed. He glanced up at Blackmood and said, "What do you want?" "Troy," whispered Blackmood, "I am here to help you escape." Troy looked up at Blackmood. "Why?" responded Troy. "Because enough is enough, and for many other reasons. I could be court-martialed for saying this, but Cringeworthy is the cruelest man I know, and Dumb isn't far behind. I have decided that to follow orders is not necessarily the right thing to do, so I have decided to do something about it." Troy felt that now he could trust Blackmood, so told her that his mom and friends were coming down to try to help him escape. He didn't entirely trust her enough to mention the box, and certainly not Pangy. While Blackmood was gently wiping away the dried blood off Troy's chin, she told him they didn't have long to come up with a plan. She also said that security was very high. To simply waltz through the security gates at the entrance would be next to impossible. Then Troy asked her about the metal boxes that were moving around camp seemingly on their own. "Ah, you mean the RTBs? The robotic transport boxes?" "Yes, there is a central command center for them all next door to this building. Each machine can be programmed to deliver or pick up anything from any of the buildings and take them to wherever they are desired." Troy thought about this. Then he asked, "Would I be able to slip inside one? Blackmood caught on right away. With a smile, she remarked, I can see exactly where you are coming from. Yes, to answer your question, you would easily fit in one. Since I have clearance to program the RTBs, I could certainly program one to pick you up, and, at a squeeze, pick up Desmi and Nesbit as well. Ah, but where to take you? But Troy was one step ahead of her. He had already thought about that, and had a text back from the guys to say that probably the best place to pick them up was on the west side of the fence, just behind the large waste bins. They had already started cutting a large circle through the link metal fencing. When Troy mentioned this to Blackmood, she almost giggled. Yes, Troy, that would be perfect. And the waste bins were continually being visited by the RTBs to offload shredded paper, etc., so wouldn't raise any suspicions. She told Troy she would go to program an RTB to pick him up and Desmi, and also Nesbit, who had been shoved into a cell by Darling, while he also went for lunch. Blackmood rushed off to the RTB command center. Nobody was there, luckily. Even programmers need to eat. She went to a console and looked at the screen for the nearest RTB to the interrogation block, and there was one, RTB 4. She laid in the course coordinates and the digital message display, which would give the RTB authority to enter the cells of Troy and Desmi. It only seemed to be 5 minutes later that an RTB beeped its way straight to the cell that Troy was being held in. It trundled up to the MPs and stopped just in front of them. The large digital screen on the top of the RTB flashed into life and began typing out a message. The MPs read the message, which said, Clearance Level 5 to clear cells 3 and 6 of debris. Troy's cell number was 3 and Desmi's was 6. All security personnel were instructed to obey any commands that the RTBs issued. So they duly unlocked the door and allowed it to enter, closing the door behind it. The RTB stopped in the middle of the room. Troy could just about hear Blackmood's voice. It was coming through a small speaker, CCTV, on one corner of the RTB. It said, Okay, Troy, quickly get inside. You will see a handle on one side that will open a door. I can see you and speak, but cannot hear you. He found the handle, opened the door, and stepped in, closing the door carefully after him. There were several slits at the top, leading edge of the RTB, so Troy could just about see out, but no one could see in. The RTB came to life and trundled slowly back to the door, and a horn sounded. This was the signal to the MPs to open the door, which they did, and closed the door again once the RTB had left, never suspecting a thing. It went to pick up Desmi and Nesbit, who was thrilled to see Troy, and they all managed to squeeze in. Then the RTB trundled and beeped out of the interrogation block and made its way to the west side of the camp to the large commercial waste bins. At one point, it passed the mess hall, and who just so happened to be walking out, but cringeworthy, Darling and dumb. Darling was almost run over by the RTB because he wasn't looking where he was going. He stopped and started to admonish the RTB as if it were a person. Inside the machine, Troy and Desme could hear Cringeworthy say, "Oh, for God's sake, I've seen everything now. An officer giving a machine its marching orders." Everyone laughed at that, except Darling, of course. Troy could see the west fence looming up, the several large rubbish bins. His RTB almost collided with the container, but swerved at the last minute and continued to the fence and stopped. Troy opened the door and let Desme and Nesbit out, then came out himself. There, at the cut circle in the fence, were a host of smiling faces that were hissing at them to get a move on, to get out of the camp. Just before they left, Troy heard Blackmoot say over the RTB speaker system, "Good luck, Troy. Hurry now. Bad Breath is on his way back to the interrogation center. And all hell will break loose when he finds out you have all escaped." 5 minutes after Troy, Desme, and Nesbit had left quietly, all squeezed together in Glynis's pickup truck, Cringeworthy, Dumb, and Darling sauntered into the interrogation room. Once in, Cringeworthy ordered Darling to pick up Desme and Nesbit from the cell they were held in. Darling approached the door to Desme's cell and ordered the MPs to open the door. They did and stood back. Darling walked into the cell, holding the makeshift dog collar and lead for Nesbit, and started to say, "Well, Missy, it is now your turn for a little interrogation. And boy, am I going to enjoy this because—" Darling stopped dead in his tracks. He looked to the left and right, then all around himself. He thought he was missing the plot and had walked into the wrong cell. So he turned around and said to the MPs, "Okay, which cell is the girl prisoner and the dog held in? Is it number 3 down the hall?" The MPs looked at each other, then turned back to Darling, and one of them said to him, "No, sir, they are in this cell, cell number 6, and they certainly haven't left. We have been on duty all the time." "Well," exclaimed Darling, "where are they then?" He stood back as the MPs ran inside and looked around. Don't know, sir. I can confirm that they hadn't left during all this time that we were on duty." Darling replied, "Has there not been anybody who has had access to the cell?" Darling's voice was beginning to tremble. He was thinking ahead now as to what Cringeworthy would say and do. "No, sir," replied the MP. "We only unlocked the door once, and that was to let in an RTB, which had authority to enter and collect any waste. It was only in there for 30 seconds, then left by itself." Darling's brain was racing now. He was in deep thought, trying to think if the RTBs had anything to do with the prisoners escaping. Wait a minute. The main body of the RTB is space, easily enough to hide a small person and a dog. Darling went as white as a sheet. His train of thought continued. So, if the girl and dog hid in the RTB, did it collect or already contain the boy? Darling was shaking now. He set off like a rocket, to the cell Troy was being held in. He demanded those MPs that they unlock the door so he could check the prisoner, which the MPs did. Darling knew what he would find before he walked in. Nothing. The boy wasn't in his cell either. He gulped a couple of times and ran back to the interrogation room. He threw the door open and stood there, not saying a word. Cringeworthy was at his desk, looking very relaxed, sipping some black coffee out of a mug. Dumb was at his little trolley, picking up the various instruments of torture and holding up the light to admire them. Cringeworthy turned his head and saw that Darling was stood stock still in the doorway. He noticed the look of abject terror on his face and started laughing. Darling, you look like you have seen a ghost. Cringeworthy started to laugh. Not a normal laugh, a very squeaky sort of laugh that sounded very wrong. When Darling didn't respond, Cringeworthy continued. Okay then, Darling, give me the life or death news. You couldn't get that mutt of a dog to sit and beg. Again, he laughed his squeaky laugh. By this stage, Dumb had caught on to what was happening and deliberately started shaking his head from side to side when Darling glanced at him. He knew this would wind Darling up, and he wouldn't be able to do anything about it. Darling started to stammer badly as he began to tell Cringeworthy what had happened. Well, you see, sir, Cringeworthy hissed at him. For God's sake, man, spill the beans. You sound like an old car engine trying to start on a cold winter's morning. Darling took a deep breath and blurted all the information very quickly in one breath. Well, you see, sir, the prisoners have escaped, disappeared. What? Remarked Cringeworthy, who had now risen to his feet and was walking towards Darling. They've gone, sir, the prisoners. They've disappeared into thin air, sir, said a trembling Darling. For a second, Cringeworthy stared at him in disbelief and shouted at him, If I find out you've been drinking, I will have your guts for garters. Right? Come here now, Darling. Darling did as he was told and stopped a couple of feet away from Cringeworthy. No, even closer, Darling. And Darling tentatively moved 2 foot away from Cringeworthy. Now, breathe on me. This was Cringeworthy's attempt to check if he could smell alcohol on Darling's breath. Cringeworthy sniffed the air coming out of Darling's mouth. He winced a bit, screwed up his face, and quickly stepped back a pace, then said, No alcohol, but by God, man, your breath smells even more rank than mine. Step back immediately, Darling. Darling did as he was instructed. While all this was happening, Dumb, who by now was directly behind Cringeworthy, was enjoying every second of this. To see Darling digging a deeper and deeper hole for himself filled him with joy. Luckily, he managed to keep the smile off his lips because Cringeworthy whipped around and ordered him to investigate what the stupid, senseless imbecile is rabbiting on about. Dumb left immediately, but was back 10 minutes later and told Cringeworthy that, in fact, and he hated saying this, but Darling was right. The boy, girl, and dog were not in the interrogation block, questioning both sets of MPs guarding the prisoners. They confirmed in both cases the cells were visited by an RTB with orders on the digital display to remove any rubbish from the cells so that the prisoners could have possibly escaped inside one. Cringeworthy marched purposely up and down the interrogation room, muttering to himself, if they hid in those infernal machines, where would it have taken them? Someone must have programmed a machine to visit the cells. Aha! There must be a record somewhere of who programmed the machine to visit the cells and, more importantly, where it ended up. While Cringeworthy was walking away from the interrogation room door, Blackmood slipped in quietly and quickly sat at her desk. As Cringeworthy turned to walk back up the room, he glanced up and stopped in his tracks. Blackmood? Inquired Cringeworthy. Where the devil have you been? Oh, I'm sorry, sir, Blackmood replied. I was having my lunch, which was a little later than yours, sir. Cringeworthy accepted this with a grunt, and then barked. Well, then, all of you, let's go to the building where they program these infuriating mechanical machines. I want to know who programs them and where this particular one ended up. Darling led the way to the programming control center next door. They all trooped in. By now, since lunch had finished, it was pretty full of laboratory-coded scientists who were responsible for the management of all 65 RTBs on camp. He glanced around for the most nerdy-looking of them all, and there was Professor Henkel. Cringeworthy had him brought over. Cringeworthy instructed Henkel to tell him who had programmed the last RTB to visit the interrogation building and where it ended up. Henkel went to a keyboard and typed in the relevant information. A few minutes later, he came to Cringeworthy with an answer. Well, said Henkel, I can confirm that RTB number 4 visited the interrogation block at lunchtime today, visited 2 cells, and then proceeded out of the interrogation block and made its way to the rubbish compound next to the west fence. It is still there now. Good, well done, Henkel, remarked Cringeworthy. I don't suppose you can tell me who programmed the machine, can you? Henkel typed a few more instructions onto the keyboard and studied the computer screen, then turned to Cringeworthy and said, No, I'm afraid I can't. That information, which should be here, has been cleverly deleted by someone who knows what they are doing. Cringeworthy narrowed his eyes. There was an enemy in their midst. But now was not the time to investigate that. First things first, he needed to apprehend the escaped prisoners. So they all rushed out and jumped into the SUVs and rushed to the rubbish bin area. They trooped out, and it was Dumb that had wandered behind the last rubbish bin, which had been pushed almost up to the fence. He called everyone over, said nothing, but pulled the large rubbish bin back to reveal a large circular hole that had been cut into the link security fence. For a moment, Cringeworthy stared at the hole. This had to be where they escaped, but he swore then and there that they might have outwitted him this time. But they would pay for it, and pay dearly. They all jumped back in the SUVs and sped off towards Apple Tree Farm, hoping to catch the prisoners before they went into hiding. Thank you for listening. Stay tuned for Chapter 10. Don't forget to like and subscribe. In the description below, I've included links where you may find and purchase this book.